the metal gate, slammed shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot, while I looked at Julian only to find his face was a mask of cold indifference. The officer didn't even ask for my ID because he already knew my name, as everything I thought I owned was being seized in seconds. My husband leaned in and whispered that it was all for my protection. But for the first time in 14 years, I felt like his prey. I am 39 years old, and I used to believe that love was a silent contract, where I was a woman who signed papers without reading the fine print because I trusted his hand. Julian was the anchor of my life, while I was the one drifting in a dream of safety, never realizing that an anchor could also be used to pull you under. Now the terminal lights are blindingly bright, and as the air turns cold, I am finally waking up. The airport was a chaos of moving bodies, but inside this small circle the air suddenly felt thin and frozen as I watched the officer's face for any sign of a mistake. But his expression remained hard as stone, while Julian's hand on my shoulder felt like a heavy weight pulling me down into a dark ocean. I noticed the way his fingers trembled slightly even as he tried to maintain his usual composure, because every movement by the security team was cold and deliberate. The officer guided us toward a glass-walled area where conversations looked calm but felt controlled, as I walked past travelers who were laughing while my own identity was being shredded. I walked past travelers who were laughing while my own life was being paused mid-sentence during this screening. The glass muffled the terminal sounds, but I could see the subtle, sharp flinch in Julian's jaw. He wouldn't meet my gaze, and his eyes stayed fixed on a point somewhere far behind me. Every step felt heavier, as I realized this was not about security rules or random checks. A female officer joined us with a folder, and her posture was so precise it suggested a cold procedure. She looked at me as a series of data points that needed to be verified against her glowing screen. Nothing about her presence suggested empathy, because she was merely a cog in a large machine. She leaned in and asked if I had ever owned any property or registered a business in an overseas territory. I answered no without any hesitation because the truth felt like a solid wall I had built upon. But as she flipped the pages, I saw my own signature staring back at me like a threat. I realized then that the papers I signed at our dining table were never for my protection. Julian had stood over me with a pen and a smile while I signed away my safety. Those signatures were ghosts of a past I had ignored because I chose to trust him. I remembered him telling me these were just routine documents for our retirement and our future. I didn't read the fine print because I believed his love was a protective shield. Now those same signatures were evidence of a massive financial structure I had unknowingly authorized. The realization came slowly, like dust settling in sunlight, that trust can be quietly weaponized. I looked at Julian, and for the first time in 14 years, I didn't recognize the man standing there. Through the thick glass of the isolation room, I watched Julian speaking to a senior officer with gestures that were far too small and controlled. He shifted his weight with a practiced ease while maintaining a mask of composure he had perfected long before we reached this airport. He didn't approach the glass or search for my eyes as he maintained a distance that felt heavier than any loud accusation. I sat back slightly and forced my fingers to unclench while pretending calm as my mind raced through possibilities I couldn't yet speak. The silence between us was shaping the room into a space of absolute abandonment. The female officer returned to the desk with a second folder that looked heavy with secrets and asked me to verify each page. Each initial I provided felt like I was physically reclaiming a tiny piece of the agency I had unknowingly surrendered to his care. I noticed the way the ink bled slightly on the paper as my hand trembled despite my efforts to remain still. She explained that my cooperation would help determine if I was a willing participant or merely a victim of his hidden greed. At that exact moment, I realized my husband had already moved to the other side of the glass to protect himself. The airport announcements echoed through the hidden speakers while travelers rolled past us, completely unaware that my world was being dissected. Every glance I caught from him through the partition was now data that I absorbed and stored in my mind with a cold clarity. Julian kept his posture steady and almost casual, but I could feel the tension ripple through him like a silent warning. I was learning that authority and legal procedure carried much more weight than any emotional outcry or public confrontation. Control was something I now understood was never given away, but was always quietly and systematically claimed. I felt a slow and creeping awareness settle deep inside my chest as I replayed the memory of the papers he brought to our dining table. He had pushed those documents across the wood claiming they were harmless and protective, but each one had been a carefully laid trap. I sipped the water they gave me slowly and let the coldness settle my nerves as I watched him through the glass. Trust was a silent bond that he had weaponized with meticulous care, while I was busy believing in the myth of U.S. The realization came like a cold draft in a warm room, because the man I loved was the architect of my ruin. The officer asked more questions about our joint accounts, and I answered with a voice that was gaining a new and steady strength. I noticed Julian's subtle microsmile as he spoke to the guards, and I realized the game had begun in earnest. Every word from the official felt like a thread I could pull to unravel the truth, and I was catching on faster than he expected. I was no longer the woman who signed without looking because the pressure inside that glass cage had finally forced my eyes open. Julian still believed he held the key to my silence, but he had no idea that I was already rewriting the ending. I remembered the many solo trips Julian had taken over the years with documents pre-approved and funds secured, while delivering reassurances without any question. Minor delays and small signatures were all just points on a map I had never noticed until this very moment. The realization settled into my bones that none of this was an accident because every piece had been placed deliberately. I watched him through the glass and realized that my silence was starting to make him more uncomfortable than any accusation. I was finally seeing the cold architecture of a betrayal that I had unknowingly enabled through my own trust. The officer returned with folders containing pages I barely recognized featuring numbers and properties and business licenses, all linked to my identity. I read through each line slowly, while absorbing the implications of names and figures that once seemed mundane, but now felt dangerous. It was clear that someone had been using my life as a shield for personal gain while leveraging my trust for years, patiently. The man I had loved and relied upon for over a decade was standing at the very center of this web. Everything was linked. Everything was his. Through the glass, I watched Julian interact with the other officers with gestures that were precise and a mask of composure that hid manipulation. Every nod and every measured movement was a performance of normalcy, but beneath the surface, I could finally see the calculation. I noticed the way he checked his watch every few minutes, and the slight tightening of his shoulders whenever an officer looked my way. I realized that power is not always a loud or visible force because it hides in the shadows of silent and daily details. I had lived for 14 years believing that his calm meant my protection. I tried to imagine the broader consequences of banks and international authorities and the legal constraints that I had never anticipated. Fear was present in the room, but a new clarity settled beside it because understanding the depth of his actions was my first step. I sipped my tea slowly and let the warmth ground me while I watched him struggle to maintain his facade under the flickering lights. For the first time in my marriage, I did not see myself as a passive participant, but as a measured and calculating observer. Silence was more powerful than any loud confrontation because it allowed me to build a strategy he could not see. The officer returned again with more documents in hand and requested my final verification with words that were deliberate and precise. Each affirmation of the truth reinforced a quiet authority that I was reclaiming in small and almost imperceptible victories. Every gesture and every line verified became a layer of preparation for the exposure that Julian could not possibly anticipate. I felt a strange strength building quietly in the measured space between my observation and my restraint. I was no longer afraid. I was ready. I watched him shift his weight near the door and check his phone with a nervous twitch that he couldn't quite hide. He still believed that I was the same woman who signed those papers without looking, but he had no idea I was reading every single move. The dynamic had changed the moment I stopped asking for his help and started looking at the evidence with my own eyes. The air in the airport felt heavy with the scent of jet fuel and secrets, but I breathed it in like it was the first taste of freedom. He looked at me through the glass, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. The official leading the investigation leaned closer, while whispering a detail that made Julian's entire posture stiffen in recognition. He didn't look angry yet, but his movements became overly careful, as if he were walking on a thin layer of ice. I watched him through the glass and realized that the same sentence had been repeated twice by the guard near the exit. I stopped swallowing and let the cold realization sink in that this was no longer a misunderstanding but a trap. The moment I had been waiting for was finally arriving, and the air in the room felt thick with a looming storm. I sat back slightly and forced my fingers to remain limp while I watched Julian struggle to maintain his casual facade. He kept his shoulders square and his voice low, but I could see the tension ripple through his jaw like a silent warning. The waiter from the airport lounge walked past the glass and shared a brief, knowing look with the officer in charge. I let the phrase hang in the air between us as I tasted the threat in its rhythm and observed Julian's subtle flinch. Every inch of his body seemed to be whispering secrets that he had spent 14 years trying to hide. I sipped the lukewarm water from my cup and let the plastic edge press against my lip as I measured his every breath. The airport around us continued its quiet chatter, with oblivious travelers passing by while our private tension thickened like a fog. Julian tried to gesture toward me as if asking for support, but I remained perfectly still and offered him no comfort. My eyes stayed fixed on him, and I was scanning for every twitch of his fingers and every blink of his eyes. The game of masks was over, and the silent battle was now unfolding over folders and whispered lies. When the senior officer returned and leaned in to whisper the same question again, I felt my chest tighten with anticipation. I noticed Julian's subtle micro-smile, and it was fleeting and cold, and I realized he was still trying to manipulate the narrative. Every word from the official felt like a probe or a thread I could pull to unravel the truth he had woven. I was catching on faster than he expected, and the fear behind his eyes was becoming impossible to ignore. The dynamic was shifting, and I could feel the ground beneath his feet beginning to crumble. I looked down at the documents again and saw the names of companies I had never heard of, but which bore my signature. The scale of the deception was breathtaking, but I kept my expression neutral as I absorbed the cold reality of his greed. He tried one last measured gesture toward the staff, but it landed hollow and ineffective against the weight of the evidence. The power he once held over me was dissolving into the clinical light of the interrogation room. I was no longer the victim of his story, but the witness who was about to bring it all down. Julian's mask finally shattered when the officer placed a final, red-stamped paper on the table between us. His voice lowered instinctively as he tried to bargain, but the authority in the room had already moved on. I felt a strange sense of peace as the pressure reached its peak, because the truth was finally louder than his deception. I was standing on the edge of a new life, while he was drowning in the secrets he had built for decades. The pressure had finally broken him, and I was the only one left standing. The boarding gate felt impossibly crowded, with the hum of travelers mingling with the distant announcement tones while I fixed my attention on Julian. He stood near the officer with smooth gestures and a calm voice projecting an authority that I was about to quietly and systematically dismantle. I moved deliberately into a position of observation and control while cataloging every micro-expression he displayed during his final performance. The balance of power was no longer a hidden secret because the truth was starting to leak into the open air. I understood fully now that public perception could shift with a single calculated act of truth, and I was no longer afraid of the fallout. The officer called me forward again with the final papers in hand, and I walked slowly, letting every step reflect a composed and heavy certainty. I could feel Julian's eyes tracking my every movement, and the subtle tension in his posture revealed cracks in the mask he could no longer hide. The crowd around us moved unaware, but their presence heightened the stakes and amplified the pressure in a way that was completely palpable. This was no longer a private matter contained in a small room, because the exposure was going to be public and deliberate. I was stepping into the light while he was receding into the shadows. I placed the documents on the counter and began explaining the discrepancies by referencing dates and signatures with absolute and chilling clarity. The officers listened and checked their screens while the weight of the situation shifted undeniably as my words became solid evidence. Behind me, I felt the change in the air as Julian realized that the control he cherished had quietly and permanently left his hands. The silent authority I had built through hours of patience was finally manifesting into a visible and undeniable consequence. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. The officer asked a pointed question about a specific transaction, and I answered factually while referencing the prior documents he had falsified. Julian's mouth twitched as his controlled reaction failed him, and his gestures became slightly erratic while his voice lowered, instinctively. The calm mask he had worn for 14 years shattered completely in that moment, even though it was only visible to those who were paying attention. I continued presenting the facts with a quiet authority that recalibrated the entire perception of power in that crowded terminal. The truth was finally louder than his lies. Through the glass, I could see the finality in the officer's eyes, which was a silent confirmation that the truth had been fully exposed. Julian tried a measured gesture and a polite comment toward the staff, but it landed hollow and ineffective against the clarity of the documented facts. The structure of our entire marriage had flipped efficiently and decisively in plain view of the world without me ever raising my voice. I had reclaimed my agency and imposed a consequence that would remain with him far longer than any temporary or shouted accusation. I was finally free, and he was finally seen. I walked slowly away from the counter, and each step felt deliberate while I absorbed the heavy weight of the power that had just shifted. The hum of the airport terminal resumed its ordinary rhythm, but the space between Julian and me had been altered forever. I realized then that control is not something that is ever given back, but it is something you must take through strategic patience. The quiet aftermath of the exposure was mine alone to inhabit, and I felt no need to explain or justify my actions. I reflected on the years of blind trust and the signatures I had provided without question, and I acknowledged my own role in that silence. Awareness does not erase the past, but it reclaims the future by transforming a silent complicity into a measured and firm authority. Betrayal does not always need a loud ending because a quiet and documented truth can be much more decisive. I step forward, now knowing that my own calm and my own awareness will guide every choice I make from this point onward. The glass partitions of the terminal reflected a woman I barely recognized, but one I was finally ready to meet. Julian remained behind with the officers, and his shadow looked small and insignificant against the bright lights of the concourse. I did not look back to see if he was watching me because his gaze no longer held any power over my identity. The air outside the terminal was cold and sharp, but it tasted like the first breath of a life I could finally call my own. I learned that patience and silent observation often yield more power than confrontation ever could, and that awareness is the first step toward reclaiming control. Trust wisely and act deliberately, because even the smallest details can carry immense consequences when they are woven into a life of deception. When betrayal arrives quietly, it can be confronted with a strategy that is equally quiet but absolutely final. Have you considered where calm patience could allow you to reclaim authority in your own life? What small acts of observation today might build the foundation for your future power quietly and deliberately?